The air in Hawaii has a particular scent. It's heavy, sweet, a mix of plumeria blossoms and the saltwater tang of the Pacific. On that Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, it was perfectly still. Sailors aboard the magnificent battleships were stirring awake, anticipating a day of liberty under the tropical sun. They felt secure, protected by the vastness of the ocean and the might of the United States Pacific Fleet. But more than anything, they felt superior. For decades leading up to that fateful morning, a story had been told. It was whispered in the halls of power in Washington, repeated in the officers' clubs from San Diego to Manila, and splashed across newspaper headlines. It was a story of certainty, a narrative insisting that the Empire of Japan, while ambitious and noisy, was fundamentally a second-rate threat, that they were clumsy imitators, incapable of true innovation, and that their soldiers, especially their pilots, simply couldn't match the grit, the skill, and the inherent aptitude of the Western man. It was a narrative built on complacency, reinforced by profound prejudice, and accepted as gospel truth. And it was a deadly lie. When the first planes bearing the blood-red Hinomaru, the rising sun, appeared over the mountains of Oahu, they carried more than just bombs and torpedoes. They carried the collapse of an illusion. In less than 2 hours, the world view of a superpower would be shattered, and the price of that arrogance would be paid in fire and blood. This is the story of how America deceived itself, and the brutal reality of the warriors they dared to disdain. Part 1. The Architecture of Arrogance. To understand the profound shock of Pearl Harbor, we must first understand the mindset that made it seem impossible. This wasn't merely a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination, a catastrophic cultural breakdown. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the image of the Japanese in the American mind wasn't that of a formidable adversary. It was a caricature. If you look at the political cartoons of the era, the depiction is almost always the same. The little men, buck-toothed, bumbling, squinting behind thick Coke bottle glasses. This wasn't just popular prejudice, it informed policy. If you bought a product stamped "Made in Japan," it was synonymous with a cheap, shoddy imitation of Western quality. The phrase itself was a punchline. The very idea that this nation, a nation they believed couldn't build a reliable toaster, could engineer complex, state-of-the-art machines of war, let alone operate them with lethal efficiency, was laughable. And nowhere was this prejudice more pronounced, more blinding, than in the realm of aviation. A persistent, bizarre mythology had taken root deep within Western military circles. It was genuinely believed that the Japanese were biologically unsuited for flight. The theories, discussed seriously by high-ranking officers, were absurd pseudoscience. They claimed the Japanese lacked an innate sense of balance, a defect stemming, supposedly, from being carried on their mothers' backs as infants, rather than in prams, which allegedly stunted the development of the inner ear. More pervasive and more damaging was the myth of their eyesight, myopic, chronically nearsighted. How could such men possibly handle the rapid focal shifts required for high-speed aerial combat? It's a comfortable fallacy. It allows military planners to look at Japan's growing air force and simply shrug. They saw what they wanted to see. The bias was so ingrained it became official doctrine. In 1934, U.S. naval intelligence formalized this prejudice, reporting that the Japanese anachronistic mentality and their inherent lack of technical and scientific imagination would keep them perpetually behind the West. It fundamentally colored how all data was interpreted. If a pilot crashed during training in the U.S., it was an unfortunate accident. If a pilot crashed in Japan, it was held up as proof of their racial incompetence. When Western military attachés observed Japanese maneuvers, their reports often dripped with condescension. They saw discipline, but misinterpreted it as a lack of initiative. They saw a commitment to an ancient code, but dismissed it as fanaticism that would crumble under the pressure of modern, rational warfare. This racism wasn't subtle. It was overt, systemic, and deeply embedded. It created a colossal blind spot. The attitude trickled down from the very top. General Douglas MacArthur, the imperious commander in the Philippines, held the Japanese military capability in utter contempt. He assured Washington the islands were secure. Admiral William Halsey, known for his aggressive posture, famously used racial slurs and boasted that the Japanese fleet would be neutralized within weeks if war broke out. It was a contagion of confidence. It seeped into every level of command. Americans believed they held a monopoly on technological prowess and martial courage. They looked at the Pacific not as a potential theater of war, but as an American lake. And while America was basking in the illusion of its own superiority, across that vast ocean, a storm was gathering. A storm forged in steel, discipline, and a burning desire to prove the West tragically wrong. The Japanese knew exactly what the Americans thought of them, and they were about to use that arrogance as their most potent weapon. Part 2. The Forge of the Warrior. If America had looked closer, really looked, without the fog of arrogance, they would have seen a truth that shattered every lazy stereotype they held. Japan in 1941 wasn't some feudal museum piece. It was a nation running on fear, discipline, and an industrial engine built with the desperation of a country racing against colonization. Since the Meiji Restoration, Japan had been sprinting, not walking, into modernity. Factories, shipyards, steel mills, aviation labs, all rising out of sheer national anxiety. They weren't copying the West. They were trying to outrun it. And fused into this machine was something the West had no equivalent for: Bushido, the ancient code of death before disgrace. This wasn't poetry. This was indoctrination at a spiritual level. A belief system weaponized by the state. Unquestioning devotion to the emperor. Sacrifice elevated to virtue. Retreat equated with dishonor. And nowhere was this distilled into something terrifyingly pure, like the training grounds of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. Places like Tsuchiura Naval Air Station, the crucible where boys were broken and warriors were forged. Forget Western flight academies. Tsuchiura wasn't training. It was a controlled collapse of the human ego. Thousands applied. Only the elite were accepted. And of those, more than half would wash out, break, or die before ever touching a real battlefield. The program's goal wasn't competence, it was transformation. Instructors used pressure like a form of torture. Failure was humiliation. Mistakes were beaten out of cadets with bamboo rods. Physical exhaustion was constant. Cadets were spun until they vomited or passed out, then forced to perform calculations with shaking hands and blurred vision. They weren't building pilots. They were building reflexes sharper than steel. And the eyesight myth? The West couldn't have been more wrong. While American analysts assumed Japanese pilots had weak vision, the truth was the opposite. Trainees practiced spotting distant aircraft faster than a blink. They learned to identify stars during daylight. Their visual acuity bordered on the superhuman. They didn't see the enemy better. They saw them first. In aerial combat, that's the same as pulling the trigger first. Survival wasn't part of the doctrine. Victory was. Many pilots flew without parachutes because the idea of being captured was unthinkable. And by the late 1930s, Japan had created something no nation on Earth possessed. A corps of pilots who were not only experts, but hardened by years of real war. While American pilots trained in peace, Japanese aviators were carving their names into the skies above China, 4 brutal years of dogfights, bombing runs, and combat hours that American pilots couldn't dream of matching. And then these men were given a weapon equal to their skill, a machine that shouldn't have existed, a fighter that bent the laws of physics, a katana with wings, the Mitsubishi A6M-0. When the Zero appeared, Western intelligence simply rejected the reports. Too fast, too agile, too long-ranged, too good to be true. But the truth was even more shocking. While American aircraft were built like armored trucks, heavy, durable, padded with safety features, the Zero was designed with one obsession: outfly, outturn, and outrun everything. Jiro Horikoshi stripped out every ounce of excess weight. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, nothing that didn't contribute directly to killing the enemy. The result was monstrous. A fighter that could turn inside any Allied plane, climb like a rocket, and fly distances Western engineers considered impossible. This wasn't a machine meant to protect the pilot. This was a blade meant to strike first and kill fast. By autumn 1941, everything was in place. The Empire of Japan possessed the world's best-trained, battle-hardened, and most experienced naval aviators, armed with the single most dominant fighter on the planet. They weren't preparing for war. They were preparing for a gamble so audacious it bordered on suicide. And the most chilling part? Someone did see it coming. Someone did warn the Americans. But the warnings were ignored. Part 3. The Prophets Ignored. It would be comforting to believe the attack came out of nowhere. A sudden storm, an act of treachery no one could have foreseen. But that's the lie history tells the comfortable. The truth? The warnings were everywhere, loud, clear, repeated. And America walked past every single one of them with its eyes wide shut. Not because the intelligence was bad, but because the prejudice was stronger than the evidence. One of the clearest voices came from a man Washington had already exiled intellectually, Claire Chennault, a tactical heretic, a man the U.S. Army Air Corps shoved aside for daring to think differently. By the late 1930s, he was in China, fighting Japan firsthand, leading the future legends known as the Flying Tigers. And in the burning skies over Chongqing and Nanking, Chennault saw the truth long before anyone else. Japan was not improvising. Japan was dominating. He watched Zero fighters appear out of nowhere, cutting through Chinese aircraft like scalpels slicing paper. He saw maneuvers Western pilots didn't believe were physically possible. He watched disciplined, battle-hardened aviators fight with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. Chennault didn't panic. He analyzed. He wrote detailed reports. He charted Zero turn rates, climb speeds, attack patterns. He warned, explicitly, that American tactics would collapse instantly in a real fight. His message to Washington was brutal and simple. If we meet the Japanese head-on, we will be slaughtered. Washington's response? Silence, dismissal, arrogance disguised as expertise. To the desk-bound generals, Chennault wasn't a prophet. He was a nuisance, an irritant, a man overreacting from the stress of combat. His reports vanished into filing cabinets. But he wasn't the only one shouting into the void. Within American intelligence, a far more terrifying picture was forming. Cryptographers had broken Japan's diplomatic cipher, magic, and were reading high-level Japanese communications in real time. The signals were unmistakable. Mobilization, troop movements, strategic urgency. War was not hypothetical. War was imminent. And yet, the fatal flaw remained. America didn't fear what Japan was capable of. They only feared what they believed Japan was capable of. They assumed the blow would fall on the Philippines, or Malaya, or Singapore. They assumed Japan couldn't strike far. They assumed Japan couldn't coordinate a massive fleet across 4,000 miles of open ocean. They assumed wrong. Pearl Harbor was considered safe, not because it was defended, but because American intelligence had convinced itself the Japanese torpedo couldn't work in shallow water. They didn't know the Japanese had reinvented the torpedo with wooden stabilizing fins, a small innovation that made the impossible possible. Another warning missed, another prophecy ignored. On the ground in Hawaii, complacency had become policy. Admiral Kimmel and General Short received vague war warnings, but they filtered those warnings through a worldview already poisoned by racial assumptions and outdated doctrine. Their greatest fear wasn't an air assault, it was sabotage, internal uprising, local Japanese Americans they didn't trust. So General Short gave one of the most disastrous orders in American history. Park every aircraft wingtip to wingtip, make them easy to guard, and impossible to defend. They were preparing for a nuisance, not the catastrophe screaming toward them across the Pacific. Then came the final moment, the last warning before history snapped shut. Hours before dawn, a radar station on Oahu picked up a massive formation of aircraft approaching from the north. The operators reported it. The duty officer dismissed it. "Probably our B-17s," he said. A sentence that cost thousands of lives. The final alarm was sounded and ignored. The architecture of arrogance held, right until the moment the sky opened and the bombs began to fall. Part 4. The Reckoning. 7:48 a.m. Pearl Harbor. The moment history inhaled, and then exhaled fire. When the first bombs fell, the American reaction wasn't terror. It was disbelief, pure, paralyzing disbelief. A drill gone wrong? Friendly fire? Some unimaginable screw-up? A sailor aboard the USS Oklahoma watched the formation dive, saw the bombs drop, and didn't understand. Not until he saw the red sun on the wings. The Hinomaru, the symbol of a reality America had refused to believe. This wasn't a mistake. This was the bill coming due. The attack wasn't chaos, it was choreography. A symphony of destruction played by men who had trained for this moment their entire lives. Japanese torpedo bombers flew so low their propellers skimmed the water, their modified shallow water torpedoes sliding perfectly into the hulls of Battleship Row, technology the Americans didn't even know existed. Then came the eruption that split the harbor open. The USS Arizona, obliterated in a single blinding fireball as her forward magazine detonated. Over 1,000 lives ended in a heartbeat. The Oklahoma rolled over like a wounded beast, trapping hundreds. The West Virginia sank into the mud under her own smoke. On the airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, Bellows, the consequences of arrogance burned in neat, perfect rows. Aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, exactly as General Short had ordered, safe from saboteurs, helpless against bombers. A bonfire of American assumptions. A handful of U.S. pilots clawed into the sky. They fought with a bravery that deserves reverence, but bravery cannot overcome physics or doctrine. They were flying P-40 Warhawks, heavy, slow to climb, taught dogfighting techniques a generation out of date. And what they encountered was something out of a nightmare. The Zero. The machine Chenault had warned them about. The machine Washington insisted couldn't possibly exist. The Zero didn't just outturn them, it danced around them, a blur of white and crimson cutting through the sky like a living blade. In those minutes, American pilots learned the truth the hard way. They had been preparing for a war that didn't exist. Japan had been preparing for this war. The men flying those Zeros weren't caricatures from propaganda posters. They were consummate professionals, disciplined, aggressive, and impossibly skilled. A Japanese pilot in a Zero wasn't flying an aircraft. He was wielding a weapon. By 9:45 a.m., the second wave withdrew, and Pearl Harbor looked like a vision from Revelation. Smoke, flame, steel twisted like paper, bodies in oil-black water. 2,400 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet shattered. But the real damage wasn't the ships. It was the shattering of an illusion, the belief in American invincibility. The comfortable myth that Japan was a nation of little men with bad eyesight died that morning, died screaming. In the months that followed, that truth was hammered in again and again. Japan ripped across the Pacific with breathtaking speed, the Philippines collapsing, Singapore humiliated, the Dutch East Indies devoured. The Zero ruled the skies. Allied pilots developed what they called the Zero complex. They felt hunted, outclassed, brought knives to gunfights. And finally, America began to adapt. They studied, they learned, they swallowed their pride. The captured Akutan Zero in 1942 became the turning point, a priceless Rosetta Stone. The machine was no longer a myth. It was a blueprint. America rebuilt its doctrine, then rebuilt its aircraft, then rebuilt its strategy. Industrial might would eventually flip the script, but the cost of that arrogance, the cost of refusing to see Japan as a worthy adversary, was measured in blood. Pearl Harbor is usually remembered as a story of treachery and eventual American triumph. But beneath that narrative lies something far more uncomfortable. A warning about the lethal consequences of hubris. America wasn't blindsided because Japan was invisible. America was blindsided because it refused to look. It's easy to underestimate an enemy. It's easier still when doing so flatters your ego. Empires rot from the inside long before enemies break down the gates. Arrogance is a quiet predator. It whispers reassurance. It blinds leaders. It blinds nations. And when the smoke cleared above that burning harbor, one truth carved itself into the history of the world. They had been catastrophically, fatally wrong. Part 5. The Empire Awakes. Pearl Harbor did not break the United States. It shocked it. It humiliated it. It exposed every weakness Americans had been too proud to confront. But America's greatest strength has never been perfection. It has always been adaptation. And in the aftermath of the most devastating military failure in its modern history, the United States underwent a transformation so vast, so immediate, that even Japan failed to comprehend what was coming. Because Pearl Harbor did more than open a war. It awakened a sleeping industrial god. The shift, when a nation turned its entire body into a weapon. Factories that once built cars now forged engines of war. Women filled assembly lines once dominated by men. Steel poured from American foundries day and night, a river of metal that would soon flood every front. Bombers rolled out of plants faster than Japan could shoot them down. Ships launched faster than Japan could sink them. Tanks came in waves, then tides, then storms. This wasn't just mobilization. This was metamorphosis. The United States didn't rebuild its military. It rebuilt reality. And Japan, for all its brilliance, all its courage, all its early dominance, was suddenly staring at a war that had changed shape, tone, and scale beyond anything it had ever planned for. Japan had prepared for a quick kill. America prepared for total war. The return blow, when industry met intent. In 1943, American pilots who once feared the Zero now flew new machines, tougher, faster, deadlier, the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair. Aircraft built from studying the Akutan Zero. Aircraft built to kill the myth that had haunted them. And kill it they did. In the skies over the Pacific, the kill ratios flipped from terror to annihilation. American pilots who once prayed to survive dogfights were now dominating them. Japan lost its aces. America minted thousands. While Japan struggled to replace a pilot, America replaced a squadron with fresh aircraft, fresh fuel, fresh men. America wasn't fighting pilot versus pilot. It was fighting system versus system. And America's system was bottomless. The inevitable crush, when an empire realized it was out of time. Island by island, runway by runway, the Pacific shrank for Japan. Saipan, Guam, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. And then the unimaginable happened. American B-29s appeared over Japan itself, giant uncatchable monsters dropping firestorms that no Zero could intercept. The war that began with a surprise attack now ended with an industrial hammer falling from the stratosphere. Japan's early brilliance was never enough against America's final form. And the final lesson, the truth beneath every battle. It is easy to say Japan lost because America was stronger, but strength wasn't the deciding factor. Humility was. Japan never underestimated America again. America, after Pearl Harbor, never underestimated Japan again. The respect came too late, but when it came, it reshaped the entire war. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military failure, it was a moral X-ray. It exposed the deadliest flaw a nation can possess, the arrogance that blinds you to the strengths of your enemy and to the weaknesses within yourself. That arrogance cost Japan victory. It nearly cost America survival. On the morning of December 7th, the United States learned a lesson written in fire. The enemy you dismiss is the enemy who will rewrite your fate. And when the war finally ended, only one truth remained undeniable. They hadn't just underestimated Japan. They had underestimated what it would take to defeat them. Fade to black. Title card. Silence.